In this episode, you will discover the one critical sign that it's time to leave a marriage impacted by addiction.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life.
This week, we had Lauren Auer on the show, and we had an incredible conversation about navigating addiction, making the choice to stay or leave, and some really great co-parenting tips. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Lauren Auer is joining us again. Lauren is a therapist and founder of Steadfast Counseling. Lauren has experience in brain spotting, EMDR, Reiki, is a certified clinical trauma professional, and much more. Listeners, I encourage you to go back and listen to Lauren and I talk about the consequences of staying in an unhappy marriage on episode 140. Today, Lauren and I will be discussing how addiction impacts marriage, when it might be time to leave, key strategies for navigating divorce when addiction is involved, and how to support your mental health after leaving a spouse struggling with addiction. Welcome back to the show, Lauren.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Now, Lauren, for our listeners who may not have heard our first episode together, would you share a little bit about your journey to where you are professionally?
Yeah, I'll give the nutshell version because it is long and complex. But basically, I always knew I wanted to be a therapist. From a young age, my grandfather was a therapist. So it was something I was always passionate about. When I was in graduate school, I had to get an internship. It's hard to find an internship, so I took what I could get and ended up working with kids that were victims of abuse as well as juvenile sex offenders at the time. So initially it wasn't the population I wanted to land on, but I ended up really loving it and learning a lot. From there, it snowballed into working with trauma specifically. I started working at a larger agency where I worked at women's domestic violence shelter and a rape crisis center. And then I was working with domestic violence victims and offenders. I became the director of that agency. I was also supervising a staff dealing with their own kind of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma of dealing with clients. That was also during the pandemic. So everybody was dealing with their own kind of interpersonal trauma. Not that that was only during the pandemic, but that definitely heightened things. At that time, I was also doing a lot of foster parents, new therapists, all sorts of different populations. It was this crash course in seeing what trauma looks like for every age and stage, for victims, for offenders, for their families, for the support staff working with them, for people in the community, from every angle of working with trauma. I took all that knowledge and started my own practice in 2021. And now that's what I specialize in.
And that is trauma and the effects of trauma?
Yeah. So trauma, effects of trauma, and really a lot of times I get those clients that have pretty complex trauma. I get a lot of clients that have maybe already done a lot of therapy work and are looking to go deeper or get unstuck, something a little bit different. That's where I ended up kind of specializing in these modalities that are more somatic based, like brain spotting and EMDR, that sort of thing.
Yes, and I've heard that certainly about those different modalities. I haven't heard about brain spotting, which I'm sure we'll get into later, but EMDR, I have heard of that as well. Now, since today we are talking about if you're married to an addict, let's start with how you define addiction.
Addiction, I think there's a dictionary definition of that, but the way that I look at it is this complex pattern of behavior, and it's really rooted in an attempt to cope with pain. People develop addictions, self-regulate or escape from distress, and then it becomes this pattern of behavior that oftentimes has more additional negative effects because of that.
And for spouses who might be unsure, a woman's listening to this and she's looking for, like, what are some early warning signs that addiction is taking control of their partner?
It can look so many different ways. Some people, it's pretty clear and obvious. There's a shift in behavior, mood, demeanor. Other people are good at compartmentalizing. In terms of looking for signs, I always like to point out that unfortunately, sometimes there aren't very clear signs. So I think being able to look for any subtleties and shifts, like more emotional disconnection, or they're not as present, more avoidance, more attempts to escape or not be there, it's usually something is going on. And it may not be addiction necessarily. Shifts, whether major or subtle, are cause for just curiosity of like, hey, what's going on? Yeah.
There's obviously there's been a shift. Different women are not sure what it is, but they know something's different. And that is at least something to begin to explore.
Yeah.
Because there can be so many things. Now, could you explain the difference between substance addiction and behavioral addiction?
Substance is a lot of times what people would automatically think of when you hear the word addiction,
Right.
which is with substances. So whether that's drugs, alcohol, or pills, behavioral addiction typically looks like changes in how people are spending time. People can be addicted to working out all the time, video games, pornography, whatever. Like those are more activities. There isn't like the chemical component, but they look very similar. And oftentimes those things go hand in hand, whether they're happening at the same time or snowball into each other. So somebody could, for instance, let's say, overcome an alcohol addiction. And one of the things that helps them overcome that is going to the gym all the time and working out. And that's the addiction. And those things can sometimes just be replaced with other addictions that might be more, we'll just say, like normalized by society, right? Maybe they don't have as many harmful things about them. But as a trauma therapist, it's a sign that person isn't actually addressing what started the addiction. And they're not really, like, they're still numbing in some way by switching the addiction. They're still trying to escape, or they're still trying to not face something. And maybe they don't even know fully what that is. Just because maybe an addiction has gotten better or it's been replaced with a less, quote, severe addiction, it doesn't necessarily mean that that underlying problem has been addressed.
That makes sense, because if you're using it to mask pain or to cope, and if you haven't dealt with that, you replace it with something else.
Right.
Now, what are some of the key behaviors or patterns, you'll see in someone dealing with substance abuse, and how does that typically impact their marriage?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially because the root of these things are often so emotionally tied, if you're not dealing with what's underlying, then you're also, it's going to affect the marriage, right? So you might be more emotionally unavailable if your partner's retreating into that addictive behavior. Maybe they're prioritizing the addiction, whatever that coping mechanism is, over the relationship needs. So just as an example, again, using like working out all the time, right? Maybe that's a healthy thing for them, but if they're prioritizing their time at the gym over the relationship needs or things that are coming up, that can be problematic, of course. It's a way to sometimes just avoid intimacy and vulnerability, or not actually dealing with issues in the relationship that maybe are exacerbating whatever the addiction is. And then also that can create cycles of shame, and more shame creates further retreating into addictive behaviors. It can just be this cycle that feels never ending.
In my experience, we've certainly helped many, many women through divorce, and there was a substance abuse problem with their spouse. Now, one of the things, and that, I've heard multiple times over many years is, well, and they may not identify him as an alcoholic, but they're clearly like, he drinks so much every day. And what I've heard on multiple occasions, I can't leave because if then he gets visitation with our children, he's just going to still be drinking. Or I'm worried what he'll do if I'm gone. And I'd love for you to address, each of those fears, because I have those fears. And, in the court system, there's not any, they can do so much, and there are certain things they will do if there's evidence of substance abuse. So I'm kind of just honing in more on alcohol and drugs at this moment as that addict. But what would you say to those women listening now, or you've, heard that, where they're like, well, if I leave, then what, and I take the kids or whatever, but if the court's going to allow them to see the children and this going to happen, they're afraid of that, or they're afraid he'll drink himself to death.
Oh, that's such a hard place to
I know.
be in because it's really a valid fear. I think for a lot of people, it's definitely something that needs to be considered and can be really scary. And, the other part of that though is there's a level of that is so enabling to the behaviors. If the wife stays because she's afraid of the custody, or she's afraid he's going to drink himself to death, that is her taking responsibility for his behaviors and for what he's choosing to do, or from a trauma lens, choosing not to do, which is the healing work that is underneath that. And it's really kind of allowing it to continue at that point. It's not that simple to just stop enabling him and walk away, right? Because there are these things in place, but the best thing they can do is their own counseling to work through those things and their fears. Having a plan in place, the more support they have around them can be really positive. You could support somebody by not enabling somebody. You can set them up with, here's these resources, here's these people. Let's sit down, let's talk to your family, let's talk to my family, let's let people know what's going on, because let's try to make this as best as we can. And of course, it takes two people to cooperate in that, but having that kind of like worst case scenario plan, like if this were to happen, depending on the severity. Of course, like I said, I used to work with domestic violence. At those points, I would be working with, kids or spouses or whoever on like the safety planning of, hopefully you never have to use this, but here's this, have a code word with the kids that they, if they need to call anybody and they start talking about, can we go to Chuck E. Cheese next weekend? Like if that's the code word to where, he might not realize that's anything, but she knows when they're talking about that on the phone, that something's up and we need to go pick them up, get people involved. There's a lot of things you can do in terms of safety planning. And again, hoping that you never actually have to use it, but having those things in place oftentimes can reduce that anxiety around just having no control over these situations.
A great plan. There are things the court can do, but then again, often, but we have to explain to our clients, we've got to bring these instances up, right? So that the court sees, okay, there may be enough of a problem where they'll order an evaluation before giving them, time sharing with the children and creating a safety issue. But that's also hard for many of the clients because they may still love this person. They just can't stay married. They can't deal with, the addiction, the substance abuse here, just because that's something we've seen much more prevalently. And I think there's a part of them that thinks maybe they can, or they could fix it, but they're at a point where now they don't think so, but yet they don't want to hurt them. So that's a tough place for these women to be in, because to protect the children, this is going to have to become an issue with the court, because otherwise then they'll just have unsupervised, time, and you won't have raised the issue that concerns you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really tough spot to be in. But I think just regardless of what it is, you can't take responsibility for somebody else's healing. Even me as a therapist, right? Like, my clients are going to do what my clients are going to do. I can guide them, but at the end of the day, whether somebody chooses to use those tools or not is completely up to them. And all you can do is what you can on your side of things, how you react to things,
Right.
how you respond to things. That's all you really have control over at the end of the day.
Talking about that, when you are the spouse, and since we're women winning divorce, it's your husband, but which of course we all know this is not gender specific on addiction. But in this particular case, how, what are some of the emotional and psychological effects, say, on the partner who doesn't have the substance abuse problem?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot that can get wrapped up into that, feeling emotionally neglected and abandoned, confusion and hurt over their partner's choice of addiction over the relationship. I think sometimes these addictions can get to the point, and I've seen it, where it's like that becomes the strongest hold of anything in their life. People, they love their family, they love their spouse, but this thing has this grip, and that can make the spouse feel really hurt, of course, and really confused. And also, I think it's hard for the spouse emotionally to understand like what's going on and the depth of the pain that's driving the behavior, because maybe the spouse doesn't even understand fully. They haven't really looked at that. They're just using it to numb. And that can be a really hard thing to understand themselves as the spouse. What is actually going on? How did this happen? And I think it's really normal, natural human reaction to want to know the why and figure out like answers so that you can fix it. You can't put that on yourself. Sometimes it can become emotional struggles with the spouse. They themselves are looking for ways to cope. Sometimes that looks like other addictions themselves. That conflict between having empathy for their partner while also having their own unmet needs and figuring out that balance. I mean, there's so many emotional things that can be tied up in there, as much as the spouse can get their own counseling to deal with that too, so that they're not internalizing those things or making it seem like they failed in the relationship or they could have done more, and really working through whatever is there. Yeah. And then I think too, just like some of those psychological effects, going into maybe a new relationship down the road, having trust issues or doubt in their own perceptions, or maybe they're really hypervigilant of what their partner is doing and it feels like they can't relax, or they're really anxious, or neglecting their own needs or their own personal growth because they're so wrapped up in trying to help somebody else, because that feels like something that feels safe to them. And usually their environment is more calm and people are more happy when they are forgetting their own needs and dealing with what they need to do. But long term, that's really detrimental.
You mentioned earlier a difference. There's a healthy supporting your partner, but what's enabling? Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's important to understand really what does that mean? And if it's the same as codependency, are they the same? Are they different? But I'd love it if you could break that down for us.
Yeah, I would say supporting is more taking that stance of like encouragement, of I believe in you, like I know we can get through this. How can we explore what's really going on here, what shifted, but also maintaining your own personal boundaries around it. Whereas enabling, I think, is more like shielding them maybe from those natural consequences or avoiding addressing those underlying issues, them just always picking up the slack or making excuses for the partner or, whatever. It could be calling them in sick to work when they're actually just really hungover, shielding them from what might be a natural consequence that could maybe help propel them towards getting help, and more so trying to just maintain the status quo and like keep that addiction in the box rather than actually support them to heal it and really figure out how to get through it. Yeah.
And so do you think by doing that, because, and I've heard this before, and whether, and this is of course non-clinical, people say, okay, well, you hit rock bottom, like there has to be something, but those are going to be natural consequences.
Yeah.
If I understand you correctly, when we're enabling someone, we are keeping them from experiencing the natural consequences of their actions. Would that be fair? Would that be correct?
Yeah. And I think that as hard as sometimes those natural consequences are, it's without being able to experience them, then it's easy to develop this mindset of it's not that big of a deal. It's not hurting anyone. It's not affecting anyone's life. It really downplays the seriousness of what's going on. It's simple. Same with, kids, right? Like if your kid does something, I don't know, at school when they're little and they're in trouble for it. Let's say they don't do their homework, right? They don't turn it in. They decide not to do it. There's going to be natural consequences. They don't get a good grade. Maybe they get in trouble. But if it's like, oh, no big deal, or we'll cover for you, and that's a consistent pattern, they're not going to learn it's important or that it's serious or that it impacts them, that it's, they're not getting the benefit of what that homework is there for. All of these things, it's the same kind of concept of it makes sense to want to shield somebody you love from consequences or help them, or, you see, maybe you're empathetically seeing, oh, but you have to be able to kind of hold both of those things at the same time. Like you can love somebody, you can care about somebody, and, have them be held accountable at the same time. That is a very loving thing to do because you're helping them really do the work of healing it and getting past it at that point, rather than just keeping them stuck.
Yeah, that does make sense. Now let's, what are some signs that staying in a marriage with an addicted spouse is now doing more harm than good?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many with that, but definitely, when you yourself are dealing with your own effects of stress, whether that's physical health, mental health, you're not sleeping well, you're really anxious, whatever, where it's interfering with your life, that's definitely a sign that it's causing more harm than good. If there's children involved, if children are witnessing that and internalizing those maladaptive coping behaviors, whether it be seeing the parent that is engaging in the addiction, parent that is maybe covering for them, those are both not good things, not good examples for kids to see. Losing yourself in trying to manage your partner's addiction, where you are working harder than them, to make sure they're doing what they need to, and following up and keeping things in order, definitely a sign that it's causing a lot of harm. Of course, if there's additional like marital problems perpetuating those cycles of dysfunction or unresolved trauma, whatever that is, really any of that like escalation, I think, is definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that is very helpful. Now, from your experience, What challenges do, addicts face in acknowledging how their behavior affects their relationships?
I think that oftentimes if, they're invested in the relationship themselves, whether that's emotionally or because of wanting to not go through a divorce or financially, it's definitely difficult, I think, to be able to deal with what's actually going on and all of these consequences of what could potentially happen. And it's overcoming an addiction it's not easy, it takes a lot of work. And I think, it's not as simple as just stopping or starting to go to 12-step program groups. That's all good movement and momentum, but it's actually being able to see like the behavior change and those things shifting and putting it into action. And that can take time. It can take a lot of effort and a lot of support. So, yeah, I think all of those things really need to be paid attention to, in terms of moving beyond that.
Now let's talk about co-parenting, which is, after the divorce, you're separated. How can someone co-parent effectively with a partner who is, struggling with addiction and substance abuse?
Yeah. I think as much as they can focus on creating emotional safety and consistency for the children is really important. Kind of like what I was saying earlier about depending on the severity and the fears around it, about having some sort of plans or safeguards, keeping things as consistent as possible. Setting boundaries with the co-parenting relationship that promote healing, that promote self-reflection. Maybe that looks like having boundaries around like what topics are discussed around the kids, what kind of behaviors are engaged in, the kind of people they're hanging out with. When the kids are around, again, you only have so much control over that, but as much as those boundaries can be laid out of why that's important, it's about controlling, but for the kids and keeping things consistent and healthy for them and kind of keeping that as the center focus, being prepared to model healthy coping and emotional regulation, maybe doing some family therapy if that's something that would be beneficial. I think with the thing in mind that you don't have control over what the other person is doing, having boundaries around how you speak about the former spouse around the kids, I think is important, because at the end of the day, it's still their parent, and hopefully that person will get help. And if it's not right now, hopefully eventually they'll be at a point where they're ready to do. As much as you're speaking negatively around the kids about them, like that stuff sticks with them, and that causes a lot of complex feelings within kids. So being able to have a more neutral approach, I think, is really important. Sometimes it can be hard. Having that openness and unbiased demeanor, I think, can really create more of a safety for kids to talk to you if they're struggling or about what's going on. What did you talk about? If you ever want to talk about it, you can. Here's some other people. You can always talk to Aunt so-and-so, or setting them up with counseling, giving them other options so they don't feel like, they are on trial about what happened during that time, I think is really important.
Now, in my experience, which is very different from yours, obviously, right? Like you are a therapist and you have, work with people in a therapeutic setting, and, we're more of an adversarial setting. However, in my experience, I believe that most addicts are extremely manipulative.
Yeah.
And I, frequently have those conversations, with clients, because to be aware so they're not susceptible as much. I feel like, there's so many things to balance, right? When you're co-parenting, And I would just like to know if that is your experience and that you have noticed that, with an addict who is, not seeking help, but still in denial, if they are manipulative.
I think that's oftentimes something that goes hand in hand. Sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's more of a result of the behavior. Like if they're so focused on continuing their own behavior, their addiction, or not dealing with whatever it is, it's just easier to lie or manipulate. It feels protective of that thing that they're so held on tight to. It definitely, I think, can be very much a major issue because in order for these behaviors to continue, oftentimes it takes some lying and some hiding and some sneaking. And, there's usually some form of trust that's been broken and that becomes part of the struggle for sure. That can be really difficult.
Right. And let me ask you this, because I'd love to know, we talked about co-parenting and really, working, nobody wants to disparage the other parent. We know that's not good for the children. Courts are going to look down on that. However, your spouse or your ex, like you're leaving the children with them. We talked about a safety plan or words. What is a healthy way to have that conversation with your children when they're with their father and he has a drinking problem and he's able to he's maintained it for a long time, but there's inherent dangers that he may, if he goes overboard, there's the balance between, all right, I've got to give my kids some tools.
Yeah.
Right. And not disparage them. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and advice for our listeners who may be facing that.
There's things to consider, like the age of the child, development, their understanding, and how you have those conversations. And of course, the severity and what the specific dangers are, that sort of thing. But I think in anything, if you're going from a marriage to being in different households where there's custody and there's back and forth, to be able to try to have those conversations openly about what to expect. You're going to go Friday night and dad's going to drop you off Sunday afternoon, so they know what to expect. And I think part of that conversation can be generally like the safety. Like if, I know that I'm not going to be there with you like we were when we lived in the same house, but if you need to call me or you need to contact me, whatever it is, it depends on the age and stuff, but like maybe it's, there's different cell phones or apps or whatever where you can just contact the parent only if you don't want them to have a full cell phone plan of this is here if you ever need me, no questions asked if you're having a bad time and you want to be picked up, whatever. And I think honestly, addiction or no addiction, those are good conversations to be having anyway in a divorce,
Right.
even if it's a parent that you fully trust and doesn't have any mental health or addiction problems, letting, the kids know that there's always these options. You're always there for them and vice versa. You can always talk to your dad, like all these things. Of course, if there's the safety issue, if there's something like that, you can talk about those things without disparaging the person. And I think just like an example, if it is a really young kid, who maybe doesn't understand fully what addiction is or what it means to be drunk, you can say things to them still of, I don't know if you remember, but a lot of times me and dad would fight at nighttime. And that was because sometimes he would make some choices that would make him act kind of goofy or angry. And that's when we would get into fights. And so that's part of the reason that we're not together anymore. And we talked about how important it is that he's not acting goofy or angry at night when you're there. If he ever is, without going fully into what addiction is, they've probably seen or known things. You can generalize it to like, if you're ever in a space where there's somebody that's making you feel Like there's people arguing or there's people, even if it has nothing to do with that parent, talking about safety in general, kids know they can pick up on stuff even when they're young, and just knowing they have options of what to do can be really helpful.
Yes, that leads to another question because, we're talking about, families, children.
Yeah.
How, if a mother's concerned, like how does she prevent the cycle of addiction from repeating itself in her children, right? She's seeing this and, maybe there is some of that in, the history of the family. And that's a concern. What should they do about that? Can they prevent it? How can they address it at least?
I mean, technically, no, you can't prevent anything because people have their own free will. But I do think that in having honest, open, and healthy conversations about things helps people understand, the dangers and the signs and the solutions, and that there is help, and all of these things. I think that being able to emotionally process what's going on can be really helpful. If having the mindset of like, we're just going to get divorced, we're not going to really tell the kids exactly what was going on. We don't really want them to know about the addiction stuff. If we can shield them from that, that'll be better for them. Maybe, but I think long term, age appropriately as they're older, as it comes up in a way that's not disparaging, being able to talk about those things of, they're gonna know at some point in their life, right? They're gonna learn about drugs. They're gonna get opportunities. They're gonna be around people that are drinking. I know when we were young, we got divorced and we didn't really talk about that, but this is something really important for you to know how much that can impact somebody's life. And this example, your dad and I had a wonderful relationship until that started to become introduced. And then that's when there was problems. And so there is a lot of help. There's good things that can happen. You can make choices that go down this path or that path, age appropriately, talking about those things. But it can be a really good way to educate them in general about those things, so that when it does come time to make their own choices, they're more likely to know there's a healthy way and an unhealthy way. And I think having the stance of try not to talk about it or sweep it under the rug, really what that's communicating is that like that's a shameful thing. We don't talk about that. That's embarrassing. If they themselves end up starting to engage in those behaviors or being curious about that, then if the automatic association is that's a shameful thing, or I need to not talk about it, I need to hide that from my mom because we never talked about that stuff, or whatever it is, that is really going to perpetuate it. Yeah.
And I think, like you said, is having the productive conversations and leaving a marriage where that has taken over is also a good example of how you set boundaries, even if they don't fully understand at the time, and then you can explain later in a positive way. But again, I think it boils down to all the things you're talking about is talk about it when it's appropriate with your children, so that it's not swept under the rug and it's not something that you want to hide, you want to talk about, so that maybe they can resolve those feelings in a healthier way.
Right. And I think too, talking about it in the way that doesn't fully shame it, but is presenting it in a way of it's like a maladaptive coping mechanism, and helping them understand that whatever the things were that played into that addiction, like, for example, like, do you remember when your dad he got injured or whatever, and he was dealing with a lot, and that's when the addiction started. It's like, here's all of these things that were going on, and that doesn't excuse it. Emotionally addressing the pain or shame or whatever, that's why the addiction started. But, there is choices to, things could have gone a lot differently if we had done counseling then and really discussed what was going on, and maybe that wouldn't have been something that felt like it was needed. And so, yeah, helping them kind of see it from that lens of humanizing the person. Usually it's a person that on some level was hurting or is hurting or not dealing with things or has a lot of stuff that has really weighed heavily on them. And that was a choice to deal with that pain, and that choice impacted us. But that person is still a person, a human that is or was hurting.
What final advice would you give to a woman listening who may be struggling with a partner's addiction, but unsure if they're ready to take the step forward with a divorce?
Yeah. I would say really considering if staying is truly helping the addicted partner or if it's enabling avoidance, and really looking at their own role in that. Because I know that can be a really hard thing to do when there's been so much hurt from the other person, to look at the role that you play. But, you know, with that, it's also looking at, is staying in that relationship, is it going to allow you to be the person you're wanting to be, the parent you're wanting to be? Is it going to help your children? Are you going to be able to do those things, be the person you want to be, and have that household be what you hope and dream for it to be? I definitely would encourage that person to seek their own support and explore their own needs and their own patterns. I think a lot of times those enabling patterns aren't even like fully conscious. It's just these like automatic things. And honestly, a lot of times those might be rooted in their own history, their own family patterns, their own stuff of how they grew up or whatever, or the role they played in their family. Being able to do their own work, I think, can be really important in trying to make that decision.
Yeah, that's great. And Lauren, before we go, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience?
Yeah, of course. I think, women, they often carry so much wisdom for healing and growth, and I've seen people have just this amazing, I do what I do because I'm just like in awe of seeing people's ability to transform pain and tap into those sources of strength and compassion and create nurturing environments and move beyond these things. Like, it's incredible. I see people surprise themselves with their own strength and their own ability, with as much as outside of their own control. There is so much within their own control to really make their life what they want it to be.
Lastly, Lauren, where can our listeners find you for more information and resources?
I'm on social media. It's at Your Trauma Therapist on TikTok and at Your Trauma Therapist _ on Instagram, because the regular one was taken. My website is steadfastcounseling.com. And then I also have a Substack that I put out weekly, and that's just Your Trauma Therapist as well. It's all linked together. But yeah, I send out a article every Monday as well on that if people prefer that. So they can find me there.
We've reached the end of our show today, and thank you so much, Lauren Auer, for joining us to talk about spotting addiction in a partner, how to make the choice to leave, and how to really seek help and heal throughout that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at floridawomensLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and the link to our website in the show notes, as well as the links to find all about Lauren. Thank you for listening.